Well, if studying physics teaches you anything, it surely teaches you that the world is very surprising, beyond our powers of rational prevision. I only have to utter the words quantum theory to make the point. In 1899, any competent first-year philosophy student could have proved the impossibility of something behaving sometimes like a wave, sometimes like a particle. After all, a wave is spread out and flappy, and a particle is a little bullet, so how can something combine these apparently contradictory properties? Nevertheless, of course, as we all know, that's the way that it turns out that photons and electrons and all sorts of quantum entities actually behave. And that means, I think, that the instinctive question for a scientist to ask about any assertion, I'm not talking now simply about scientific understanding, but in the wider sphere, the instinctive question for us to ask is not, is it reasonable, as if we knew the shape the rationality had to take beforehand. We ask, I think, a different question, at once more open, but also more demanding. Our question, I think, is, what makes you think that might be the case? See, it's open in the sense it doesn't try and specify beforehand what the answer is going to be, but it won't accept an answer that isn't backed up by some form of evidential support. It's looking for truth through the search for motivated belief. That's, I think, how science operates, and I think that's how we need to operate in a wider realm of our exploration of reality. I sometimes call that way of thinking bottom-up thinking. It seeks to proceed from evidence, experience, to understanding, to start in the basement of experience, move up to the first floor of understanding. There are quite a lot of top-down thinkers in the world who start in the 10th floor of clear and certain ideas or uncontrovertible principles, and then seek to descend to the consideration of particulars. I don't say there's no scope for that form of thinking, but too often, of course, the clear and certain ideas have turned out to be neither clear nor certain, and the incontrovertible principles have turned out to be open to question. So I think we need the nudge of nature, as far as science is concerned, and the nudge of reality as far as our wider human experience is concerned, if we're really going to reach the truth. And I'm very happy to approach questions of religious belief exactly in that spirit. When I gave my Gifford lectures quite a long time ago now, they're published as Science and Christian Belief on this side of the Atlantic, and the faith of a physicist on the other side of the Atlantic. A terrible mistake I shall never make again of having two different titles for the same book. So American friends of mine, having read The Faith of Physicists, have come to this country and bought Science and Christian Belief and found it strangely familiar as they turn the pages. In those lectures, I tried to approach issues of central Christian belief related to clauses from the Nicene Creed in that spirit of bottom-up thinking. And I think we can do that because I believe the knowledge that we acquire gives us a reliable guide to the nature of reality. It's a central question in philosophy, how knowledge, how epistemology relates to the way things actually are, the nature of being, to ontology, how are epistemology and ontology related to each other. And there are a whole range of different philosophical responses made to that question, as you know. At one end, you have somebody like the great German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who essentially disconnected the two. For Kant, we can know the appearances of phenomena, but they are shadows looming up out of the mist in which we are engulfed, and we don't know noumena, we don't know things in themselves. Well, I think that's a mistake. As a scientist, I'm a realist. I mean, in fact, most of us, I imagine, wouldn't want to do science unless we felt that our scientific knowledge was telling us what the world is actually like. So it's a central question, the central question, I think, the philosophy of science, how epistemology and ontology relate to each other. I'm a realist, which means that I believe that the one is a reliable guide to the other. My wife, years ago, gave me a sweatshirt inscribed with the beautiful words, which you'd often heard me utter on occasions such as this: epistemology models ontology. In other words, what you know is a reliable guide for what is the case. You get some pretty funny looks if you walk down the street wearing that sweatshirt. Nevertheless, that's what I believe. So why should I believe that? Well, I think there are two reasons for it. One is, well, I started off by referring to the fact that the physical world is surprising. It's sort of calcinant to our expectation. It doesn't fit into the mold of thinking with which we approach it. I mean, there are lots of examples one could give. When was it? Must have been in the 1960s. Until then, everybody believed that fundamental physics had to be intrinsically even-handed. There was no preference for a right-handed view or a left-handed view. Everybody believed that parity was strictly conserved. And all sorts of puzzling results came along, and all sorts of extraordinary theoretical gymnastics were engaged in to try and explain these things, until Li and Yang came along and said, well, maybe parity isn't conserved. And you want to go and test it. Very clear, in some sense, reasonably straightforward experiments that would establish the point. And of course, people went off and they found, in fact, that parity is not conserved, that there is intrinsic left-handedness in nature, previously thought to be impossible, for reasons that afterwards dissolved and nobody could quite explain why it was thought to be impossible. And of course, there were also lots of hard luck stories about people who've been intending to do these big experiments but hadn't quite got around to doing them, and so had missed the chance of getting a Nobel Prize. So the world is surprising, and therefore our encounter with it has the feel of encountering an independent reality that is not shaped by our thoughts about it, but which resists our thoughts and shapes our thoughts in turn. The nudge of nature is part of the experience of science. And another reason, I think, for taking our scientific insights seriously is, of course, their long-term fruitfulness. They're a really good, I've heard that a little bit, I think, in passing last night, but I'll say a little bit more about it today. A good scientific idea has a long-term power, a long-term explanatory power to give us understanding of things, phenomena, some of which were not even known at the time of the original formulation of the idea. I spoke last night about Dirac's great work on the relativistic electrons. Quantum theory itself, of course, illustrates this unfolding understanding of nature. Max Planck, sitting there in 1900, he gets this radical idea that energy is emitted in drops, in packets, in quanta. He said afterwards, long afterwards, that he was very dissatisfied with this idea, but he was driven to it. Of course, it produced a very successful formula for black body radiation. But people didn't quite know what to make of that, and then in 1912 is it that Niels Bohr comes along and uses a similar sort of idea to construct the theory of the Bohr atom, which gives an explanation, a persuasive explanation really, of the Balmer formula, the mysterious numerical formula that this Swiss schoolmaster had discovered about 20 years or so earlier. And that's a great triumph, but that's not enough really, because Bohr has done it's a very important staging post on the way to modern quantum theory, but Bohr has done it essentially by tinkering with Newtonian mechanics. He takes essentially a Newtonian mechanical point of view of the atom as a sort of solar system atom and puts in ad hoc the not necessarily obviously consistent requirement that angular momentum should be quantized, the two should come in packets, just as Planck had found that energy came in packets. And then time goes on, in the middle of the 1920s, of course, you get the great explosion of quantum theoretical understanding with Schrödinger, Heisenberg, Dirac, Born, and all that. Great, those anti-mirabiles, as people say, 1925, 1926, when modern quantum theory sprang almost fully formed into the mind of those geniuses, and from them into the minds of the community. And I once heard Dirac say, and he said this absolutely simply, and in no sense in a put-down sense. Dirac was a very pure mind. He was a sort of scientific saint, and he was absolutely free from self-importance or self-interest. But I remember hearing him say in the Cavendish Laboratory tea room once that in the period following that, the end of the 20s, the beginning of the 30s, there was a period of such fruitfulness. These ideas had been formulated, such fruitfulness that second-rate people did first-rate work. And almost anybody else's, any other person's mouth, that would have been a put-down remark. But in Dirac's mouth, it was simply matter-of-fact observation. And of course, condensed matter physics and so on, all opened up to discoveries. Now, when you have experiences like that as a community, it's irresistible, it seems to me, to interpret those as a tightening grip on an actual reality. These are not just manners of speaking that by happen chance or accident turn out to have a long-term fruitfulness. The natural explanation of why they succeed is that they are in correspondence with the nature of the physical world. So we make, it seems to me, maps of the physical world. We make maps that are reliable on a given scale, but not, of course, reliable on every scale. And that means to say that our scientific achievements, or the achievements of the scientific community, are not absolute truths, the total stories. They are what you might call verisimilitude. They are accounts that are adequate on a certain scale for certain purposes, that give us a reliable insight in the nature of the reality that we've encountered. And the nature of realism, of course, is to allow your thought to be shaped by the character of what it is that you encounter. So if the quantum world is cloudy and fitful, that's how we have to think about it. That teaches us a lesson, incidentally, that there is no universal epistemology. How you know things is determined by the nature of the thing that you're trying to know. If you want to know the quantum world, you have to know it in its cloudy Heisenbergian character. If you demand the clarity of Newtonian physics, it just won't work. So there is no universal epistemology. How we know the quantum world is different from the way in which we know the macroscopic world of classical physics. How we know God is determined by the nature of God and not by other forms of epistemology. But it has to be a critical realism, both because our knowledge is verisimilitudinous and never complete, and also because it is never totally secure. It involves all sorts of acts of judgment and of intellectual daring. First of all, there is the inescapable hermeneutic circle between experience and interpretation, the interaction between theory and experiment. You can't understand experiments without having some theoretical knowledge of how you believe the apparatus you're using is going to work. But of course, theories are confirmed or disconfirmed by experimental results. So you have a subtle interchange between the two, and that there is an inescapable degree of circularity involved in scientific knowledge because of that, which often the philosophers of science, particularly the social constructivists, seize upon and claim means that it's just a manner of speaking that's been agreed unconsciously, largely, in the invisible college of scientists. So I don't think for a minute that's true, for the reasons I've already discussed. The fruitfulness and surprising character suggests that these are really understandings that are shaped and formed by nature, but they are not indubitable in the sense that they are independent of it. And again, about my philosophical hero, Michael Polanyi, whom I spoke about briefly last night, Polanyi emphasized, of course, in his great book, science is concerned with an impersonal dimension of our encounter with reality. The doing of science is inextricably, inescapably, an activity of persons. It involves acts of judgment of the naturalness of the theoretical explanation, of the adequacy of the control of background effects in experiments and so on. It involves tacit skills of that kind of judgment, which cannot be reduced to the following of a specifiable protocol. You can't delegate the discovery of Nobel Prizes in physics to well-programmed computers. It's an activity of persons. And those persons learn these tacit skills of judgment through an apprenticeship in a truth-seeking community. And again, I think there is a very obvious connection here between scientific knowledge and the way it is generated and the way it is entered into in practice with other forms of knowledge, including the theological knowledge of the believing community of the church. So those are a few things about the philosophy of science and an indication of some cousinly relationship between a scientific way of thinking and other forms of thinking. I don't see them as chalk and cheese. Out there, people think the science is simply fact, and religion is mere airy opinion. That's a bad mistake about both science and religion. Science is more subtle than fact, for the reasons I've just been discussing, and religion is more than mere opinion. There are motivations for religious beliefs. Just before we leave the subject of scientific knowledge, it might be interesting just to, for a moment, to remind ourselves of how complex and subtle particular scientific questions can be. I derive this from discussion given by Michael Berry about the behavior of the satellite Hyperion. It's a sort of irregularly shaped lump of rock which is tumbling chaotically. It's a satellite of Jupiter, isn't it? It's Jupiter or Saturn? I can never remember. It's Jupiter. Saturn. Okay. Well, I've obviously lost credibility by that unfortunate stumble, but I rely on Michael Berry for the credibility of what I'm going to say now. So Hyperion is tumbling around chaotically, and Michael's very interested in quantum chaology, and because, as I explained briefly last night, quantum theory and chaos theory don't fit together naturally, there is indeed a degree of antagonism between them. And that means that when you have a chaotic system which begins to depend upon details at the level below Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, then there will be a quantum suppression to a degree of chaotic behavior. That's the way these chaps work it out, without having a fully integrated theory. Now, if you apply that notion, apparently, to a Hyperion, of course Hyperion is quite a macroscopic object, but it turns out that even for a macroscopic object like Hyperion, the suppressive effects of quantum theory should manifest themselves after a comparatively short period of time. If I remember correctly, it's 37 years is the period of time, which is really extraordinarily short for such a big thing. Now, at the time I heard Michael talk about this, the Hyperion hadn't been observed for quite 37 years in its chaotic tumbling, but I haven't heard that it stopped chaotic tumbling, and nobody expects that it would do. And the reason for that, of course, is that there is another effect which suppresses the quantum suppression of chaotic behavior. That is decoherence. That is the interaction of Hyperion with the bath of radiation in which it exists, which has as an effect of suppressing the quantum effect. It's a little bit like the interaction with the radiation, which produces, of course, decoherence. It washes out some of the cross terms in quantum calculations, and it's a little bit like a person trying to get to sleep who keeps asking themselves, "Am I asleep yet?" And of course that keeps you awake. So the interaction with the photon field, cosmic background radiation or sun's radiation, whatever it is, suppresses it. And so Hyperion is going to go on tumbling very much longer. It's a beautiful example, and if you want to see the details of that, the paper of Michael, another of these Vatican Observatory CTNS volumes called Quantum Mechanics, in this case, which he discusses the detail of that. And it's just an example of how complicated the world is. Now, science, of course, is concerned with observation and experiment, but it's also concerned with interpreting observation and experiment in terms of unseen realities. I mean, the obvious case that comes to mind are quarks and gluons. Nobody has seen an individual quark. They make sense, of course, for the existence of quarks and chromodynamic theory and so on, make sense of a great swathe of direct scientific experience, makes sense of the hadronic spectrum of particles, makes sense of deep inelastic scattering experiments and so on. So there's strong motivation, but nobody has seen an individual quark ever, and our expectation, of course, is that nobody ever will, because we believe that they are, in fact, confined. The forces holding them inside the hadrons they compose are so strong that they can never be driven apart. It's like being attached by sort of elastic, which the force strengthens as the elastic is stretched. So, but we're very happy to believe in the existence of quarks, and I'm a passionate believer in the existence of quarks, but it is an unseen reality. And again, of course, there is an obvious cousinly relationship with religious belief. Those of us who are religious believers believe in the unseen reality of God, not because we've seen God in a direct way, but because we believe that that belief makes sense of great swathes of spiritual experience, both individual experience, the collective experience of the believing community, and of course the scripturally recorded experience of the life of Israel and the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. So there is a sort of cousinly relationship those terms. In fact, you can argue that the key to ontological belief is the attainment of deep intelligibility. The criterion of why we should believe in the existence of particular objects is that that belief offers coherent and illuminating understanding of very wide swathes of human experience. It's, so that again is a sort of cousinly relationship between science and religion. So, what more shall I say? You expect me to finish quite early, I'm afraid. I don't know why. I can't think these days. I think it's dangerous with being a scientist, actually. You know what it is? If you're a scientist, you just say what you want to say, and when you've said it, you stop. Some of my friends in the theological world are very good at continuing the discussion in various elaborated ways, and no doubt they do add more to it by the subtlety of the further elaboration, but I tend to stop there. So my theme has been that we should take a critical realist view of the world. We should be certainly critical about it. It isn't unproblematic, the belief. It's an act requiring commitment. That's a very Polanyian word. I quoted last night Polanyi's comment that he is writing this book about the philosophy of science to explain how he can commit himself to what he believes to be true, knowing that it might be false. And so it is a critical realism in that sense. But there are similarities of motivation. And I also, in a short commercial last night, spoke about my most recent book, which I'm afraid isn't out there, called Quantum Physics and Theology, which tries to pair up moments of insight in quantum physics with moments of insight in theological development. Of course, the timescales at which these take place are very different. The quantum physics is within the last 80 years. The theological understanding spread over 2 millennia. And let me just quickly give you some sort of indication. I won't go through the 14 things, but just 1 or 2 examples. In both science and theology, one of the most important gifts to have in seeking understanding is to be able to figure out what are the right questions to ask, what are the really fundamental questions that probe the phenomena, if you like, and which indicate the source of novel and unexpected understanding. I've already spoken about quark theory. There the question was, the 2 controlling questions, I think, were how to understand the hadronic spectrum and how to, then later on, how to which suggested, which gave a structure, of course, which would be the same as if the hadrons were composed of quarks. Then the question is whether really quarks, or was this just a way of thinking, was it just no more than perhaps a mathematical mnemonic for the actual structure of that? And then deep elastic scattering, where you seem to see projectiles bouncing off little hard scattering centers inside the hadrons, scattering centers that had the properties that we would associate with quarks, like fractional charge and so on. That was, I think, the real sort of confirming thing. It wasn't a direct observation. So those are the 2 questions. How do I understand deep elastic scattering? How do I understand taxonomy? If you look at Christology, I mean, I'm very keen on Christology from below, that is to say, taking the evidence about Jesus contained in the New Testament. And there are 2, here's just a couple of questions that immediately arise from that. If you read the New Testament writers, they're a very varied bunch of writers, writing different interests and different perspectives. But there's a very common feature which is sort of surprising, and that is that they're all obviously tremendously affected by what they believe to be their experience of the risen Christ, and they find that when they want to write about that, they are driven to use of Christ language which is theistic in its character. They know, of course, he's a human being who is alive within living memory, but they find that they can't adequately describe him in terms of the classical Jewish categories of particular people, the prophetic witness, and the wisdom writers and people of that character. They find that they're driven to use, despite the fact they're monotheistic Jews, despite the fact they know, Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord, they're driven to use divine-sounding language by Jesus. There are many, many examples of that. One of the simplest examples is the way that Paul begins pretty well all of his letters. He writes to the people, he says something like, "Grace to you and peace from God our Father and the Lord Jesus Christ." And we tend, when we read the epistles, to skip over that and get on to what the thing is. But that's a very, very remarkable way of opening the letter. It's remarkable because, first of all, Jesus, this historical figure of the recent past, is bracketed alongside the God of Israel, the one true God of Israel. That's a very curious conjunction. It would be inappropriate for a Jew to bracket Moses, however respectful, of course, Jewish people were of Moses in that sort of way. And then, of course, the title Lord is used of Jesus. Now, of course, Kyrios could be used just in everyday conversation, just as we use the word sir sometimes, just a sort of honorific way of speaking. But when it's used in that particular context, in the context of being associated with God, it's clearly being used, I think, not as just a respectful, polite way of speaking. It's being used as a title, and it's a title that belongs not to a human being, but to the God of Israel. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God is one Lord. As you know, the divine name was regarded as being so holy by Jewish people that they never spoke it aloud, except for the high priest once a year on the Day of Atonement. And therefore, but of course, the divine name occurs all over the Hebrew Scriptures. And so when they came to read the Scriptures, they couldn't utter the divine name itself, the tetragrammaton, but they uttered the words Adonai, which means Lord. And so Lord became a clear circumlocution for God. But that is a title that's applied to Jesus. So what's going on there? It's a very extraordinary thing. And this is happening within such a short time of the person's actual life. And then, of course, there is the resurrection. I mean, I don't want to go into all the argument of evidence for the resurrection, but it seems to me that it's something. After the miserable failure of Good Friday, when Jesus is executed, dies a painful and shameful death, regarded by any Jew as being a sign of God's rejection, curses anyone who hangs on a tree, utters the cry of dereliction that we were thinking about a little bit earlier this morning. All his disciples run away, dispirited and hopeless, and something happens to continue the story of Jesus. I think if the story of Jesus was finished on Good Friday, we would never have heard of him. I think he would have just disappeared. There were several messianic pretenders in the first century, and they're known to scholars, of course, but they're unknown to the rest of it because they've just disappeared from history. So the fact that we've heard of Jesus is itself an extremely significant fact about him. So these are the sort of questions you have to ask, and I think from those you build up a picture which seems to me is only fully intelligible in terms of the belief that indeed there was God's presence in Christ in a unique and unprecedented way. Then there is the question of another cousinly relationship, I suppose, between science and religion, is the recognition that there can be new regimes, that the past is not a wholly reliable guide to the future. At least, I should say, the experience of the past is not a wholly reliable guide to the future. I suppose one of the most extensively verified laws in physics must have been Ohm's law. I mean, generations of students have performed experiments to check that, if you've got a resistance in a circuit, you've got to have a battery to drive the current round. And it must therefore have been an astonishing discovery in 1911 when Cameron is discovered that for certain metals at certain low temperatures, as we all know, that law no longer holds. It's the resistance vanishes and you have the superconducting regime. A new regime had been discovered, but a quite unexpected and unanticipated way. Now, of course, the laws of physics, basic laws of physics, don't change at the transition temperature, but the consequences of the laws of physics do change very drastically at the transition temperature. In 1911, nobody could have understood that. It's an intrinsically quantum effect, and it took us a long time to sort it out, and there are still some unresolved problems, as we all know, about superconductivity. I sometimes use that as a sort of scientific parable to how to think about miracles. I think I said this actually before, Copy, I'll say it again. The problem of miracles is the problem of divine consistency. And divine consistency is not the unchanging consistency of the force of gravity, but is the consistency of a divine person who does particular things in particular circumstances. And when the circumstances change, when we enter a new regime, if you like, relationship between creature and creator, then it is a consistent possibility that new regime is accompanied by new phenomena. And that's how I want myself to think about the issue of miracle, in particular the central miracle of the resurrection. And in science and in theology, we see the way in which further thought, further exploration, further engagement with the reality concerned leads to deeper and deeper recognitions of significance. I talked sketchy, but more than a sketch, of the history of quantum theory, starting with Planck and then leading on to fully developed modern quantum theory. In the same sort of way, you see this sort of wrestling with understanding and the deepening of understanding in the history of theology in the New Testament period and in the early church. Jesus himself seems to have referred to himself, it's one of these things that theologians argue about, but I'll cut short the argument, seems to have referred to himself very consistently as the Son of Man. All four Gospels portray him as using that title of himself, and only in John's Gospel, where it's echoed back to him by the crowd, is it used of him by anybody else. And this is, the contention comes in about what that means. I personally think it's a reference back to Daniel 7, the vision of one like a Son of Man who appears before the Ancient of Days as the agent of God's activity to deliver the saints of the Most High. So it's a self-understanding of Jesus that sees Jesus as being of unique significance in God's salvific purposes. It doesn't imply of itself the notion that Jesus was both human and divine. And I think it's inconsistent with believing that Jesus was truly a first-century Palestinian, with believing that he actually believed himself to be the incarnate Son of God. That doesn't seem to be consistent. He had to accept that kenosis, that he knew God as his Father, but he didn't know exactly his own nature. Then I've already referred to New Testament period. The title Lord comes in, lots of other titles come in. There's a deepening of the understanding. And eventually all this leads to Chalcedon, and leads to the central theological doctrine of the Incarnation, that Jesus is both truly human and truly divine. Two natures in one person. The natures not being confused or divided, but equally the person being singular. That seems to me, people sometimes portray that as being the taking over of a simple primitive Christianity by unduly philosophically sophisticated Greek thinking, and the whole thing taking off and floating off into the air. And we should strip away all that sort of dogma and get back to the primitive Christianity. I don't think that's right. I mean, I think that I see the comparable development. I mean, Planck's idea about drops of radiation looks terribly different from the formulation of modern quantum theory in terms of Hilbert spaces and Schrödinger equation and all that sort of stuff, but there is a continuity there. The New Testament witness is different from the character and style from the Chalcedonian definition, but I think again there is a development of continuous development. I just use one more example. I got a bit of time. Just one more example of a comparison. I lived through a period of the rise and fall and rise again of quantum field theory. When I was a young man, quantum field theory was the way to think about it. It was the way to think about relativistic quantum mechanics. The renormalization program was still underway and still being further developed, and that was the place to be. And then, of course, the great successes of quantum electrodynamics were very persuasive. Then, of course, people tried to use QFT ideas for nuclear physics, which didn't work at all well, because of course you didn't have perturbation theory that worked, and people became very disillusioned with field theory. And then S-matrix theory comes along, which I worked on myself for a few years, which was a sort of slimmed down theory, which said, don't worry about what's going on in the details of the interaction. What goes in, what comes out, that's the only things we observe. Just think about how the two might be related to each other. And perhaps there are general properties that the S-matrix must possess, because of quantum theory and relativity, which will be sufficient or almost sufficient determinants. Probably a lot of us worked on that program in various ways, various years. The irony is, in the end, it collapsed under the weight of its own complication. It turned out the S-matrix models were tremendously complicated. A straightforward. And then people discovered asymptotically free theories, and so a scope for quantum theory came back, and there was a great sort of rejuvenation of that. I see some analogy between that episode in physics and the alternations that have existed in the modern history of Christology, between emphasis on the historical Jesus and the Christ of faith. 19th century saw a lot of investigation into the historical Jesus, getting back to the Palestinian. A lot of that investigation was certainly worthwhile doing, but a lot of it actually was very much influenced by the preconceptions of the people who were doing it. They wanted Jesus to be a 19th century liberal rather than an eschatological prophetic figure in first century Palestine. And Albert Schweitzer pointed that out, and that was really the coup de grace for that particular stage, historical Jesus study. And at the same time, it had been suggested that what we should really think about, and what we really needed to think about, and what we actually really knew about, was the preached Christ of faith, presented in the New Testament. Don't worry about the rather shady, obscure figure that gave rise to that, but just think of how Christ was presented to the early church. That's a bit like S matrix theory, which says don't worry about what's going on in the middle, just worry about the end product. That's pretty obvious to me, an unsatisfactory thing to do, because I mean, the Christ of faith may be an inspiring figure, but it might be an illusory figure. I mean, it's no connection with Jesus. I mean, where does it come from? It may be just somebody's making up. So then later on in the 20th century, there became the so-called new quest with historical Jesus, much more nuanced and much more careful in its investigation. That still continues, and of course, not with assured results that everybody agrees on, because these things are subtle and difficult, but at least there's been a sort of recovery of encounter there. And that's it. That would be slightly far-fetched, but it seems to me there's an analogy between my theological experience, trying to read as much as I can about Christology, it's the subject that interests me most, and my experience of having been a part of physicists. So there we are, about time I think to stop. I've had a sort of odd life of being a physicist and a priest, and of course when I gave up being the one and began to train to be the other, things changed in my life in all sorts of ways. But I think fundamentally things did not change, both in my scientific life and my life as an ordained clergyman. I see a continuity, and the central continuity is the search for truth through motivated belief. That's obviously what physics is about. I believe it's what religious belief is about. And so I see a sort of coherence and indeed a cousinly relationship between the two. But again, as I said last night, that's what I think. But I doubt that people think other things here. Perhaps have another of these very enjoyable conversations with each other. Thank you very much.
That's excellent, thank you. So let's go straight to questions. Yes?
Could you say just a little more about the critical part in critical realism? Give us a sense of why you call it critical.
I call it critical because it seems to me that our encounter with physical reality is not unproblematic. There are no interesting scientific facts, it seems to me, that are not already interpreted facts. We can no doubt all agree that you turn on the switch and the galvanometer reading moves to 1.7 or something on the scale. But that's not interesting itself. Don't we know what's going on, what the circuit is, what's being measured, that sort of thing. So all scientific facts are already interpreted facts. And that gives them a degree of precariousness, because the interpretation comes from theory. Theory itself has to be confirmed or disconfirmed by experiment. So you get this circularity between the two. And therefore you have to justify. I mean, there are people who think the science really just makes up a story. It's a sort of reasonably consistent story, and all the people who belong to the Invisible College of Scientists agree on it. I mean, Andrew Pickering, who's a philosopher of science, wrote a book called Constructing Quarks. And the thesis of there is that the physicists, mostly unconsciously, got together and agreed to look at high energy physics in a quark-like way, and that was all that was going on. For reasons I've sketched, and I'm sure common knowledge knowledge that most of all of us here, I think that's very misleading. But it's not unproblematic. There is a degree of intellectual precarity. There's a need for a degree of commitment in scientific investigation. I think that commitment is rational in the sense that it's motivated, but it's not absolutely conclusive.
And this applies in theology as well?
Oh yes, but more so, obviously. Yes. I mean, obviously, because we're dealing. I mean, our great secret weapon in science is that we transcend the physical world and can put it to the test. We can't put God to the test in that sort of way. When we move from the impersonal realm of science into the personal realm, either encounter between ourselves or transpersonal encounter with the reality of God, testing in some sense has to be a way to trusting. That's not a sort of blind faith, trusting, but it's an indispensable part of it. If I've always said in little traps, to see if you're my friend, I'll destroy the possibility of friendship between us. You shall not put the Lord your God to the test. It's just a fundamental fact of the spiritual life, I think.
There is a question mark about the realism part, I guess, in quantum theory with certainly some of the interpretations. Maybe not least Bohr and the Copenhagen interpretation, and Wheeler more recently, and
well, of course, there are lots of conflicting interpretations of quantum theory. I mean, I think, for the reason I, in a sense, sketched when I talked about unseen realities, I mean, I take a realistic view of this. See, Einstein, of course, as we all know, was the grandfather of quantum theory through the photoelectric effect, and he hated his grandchild, and he really wanted to dispose of this redshift difference, and so he was always trying to do it down. And he was motivated, I believe, principally by his passionate conviction of the reality of the physical world, but he confused realism with objectivity. He wanted the physical world to be unquestionably objective in an absolutely everyday sense. And I go back to what I said sometime at the beginning of my talk. The essence of realism is to conform your thinking to the nature of the thing you're trying to think about. And the quantum world is not unproblematically objective in the way that the Newtonian world seemed to be. And we just have to accept that. We have to think about it in a way that accords with its Heisenbergian veiledness, if you like. So of course, obviously a similar consideration applies in spades, you might say, to our encounter with the divine reality. Realism is not the same as objectivity. That's why we need both the affirmation of realism and the warning of criticality.
that's a helpful answer. Thank you. Yes?
Yes, I'm not sure that I quite...
Stand up.
Yes, I'm not sure that I quite understand the difference between your point of view and Kant's point of view.
Whose point of view?
Kant's point of view that you mentioned at the beginning.
Oh.
That things in themselves and the phenomenal appearance of things.
I don't think we know things exhaustively themselves, but I think we know verisimilitudinously, we know reliably the nature of things in themselves. Kant wouldn't agree with that. We think that things in themselves it is just the appearance of things, the shadows of phenomena. It's, I suppose it goes back in some sense to the Platonic picture of the cave, except it doesn't really even see what's going on outside the cave. And Kant thought, for example, that a great deal of human thinking is forced into the shape of certain categories. He thought that our notions of space and time, and indeed of freedom and so on, were necessary categories of thought that didn't necessarily correspond to the reality of things. And he thought also that actually the Euclidean geometry was a necessary mode of thought about the structure of the world, which is a little bit of warning to philosophers not to be overconfident in their predictive powers.
So you're saying that Kant believed that we impose structure on the world by our mind, that our minds somehow determine the structure.
He would say that our minds have to, in order to be able to think at all in a coherent way, we have to have certain pre-existing categories of thought which shape our thought, and which notions of space and time are a very important thing. So in that sense, the nature of things in themselves, the nature of noumena, whether they are temporal, spatial, and so on, that's an entirely independent question. It's just that's the way we have to organise our thought. I just don't think that's right. I mean, he's obviously a very, very great man, tremendously influential, perhaps the most influential philosopher of modern times, but I don't think he got that right. I'm not an expert on Kant, but that's how I understand his thinking.
Yes.
You touched upon this question I was thinking about, and that's the aspect of necessary truth and contingent truth. As I understand it, the contingent truth is really the most important aspect of modern science, because you talked about parity validation, and of course ideas like we hold dear of momentum conservation or conservation of charge could be in theory be proven wrong through experiments in the future. So have you any view of that and to the theology? Excuse me.
I think we have to be open to surprise. And of course, when people first looked in detail at radioactive decays, they wondered whether energy was conserved in those decays. Then you get the notion of the neutrino, which sort of saves the day. So there is a sort of precariousness in these things, and there is certainly of course a revisability about these things. That's again why I want to use the language of verisimilitude, and we may have to revise things in substantial ways. Nevertheless, I think we have to do the best that we can with what we've got. And I think the rational thing to do is to commit ourselves to well-motivated belief. As I say, knowing that it might be wrong and open to correction. But I don't think we're lost in a Kantian fog. I don't think that skepticism is a fruitful or indeed actually a possible position to take. People outside science sometimes say scientists doubt everything. That's always not true. I mean, you would get nowhere if you would be absolutely paralysed if you doubted everything. If you couldn't trust anybody, you would be just stuck. So, and let me just say a word about proof. I mean, proof in an absolutely logically necessary sense is a very limited category, I think. The proof where, with the certainty that would mean you would say to somebody, you are stupid if you don't agree with me. I think there are very few things we can say. I mean, Gödel's theorem shows that even mathematics is not so unproblematic as it might seem. Axiomatized systems cannot establish their own consistency. There aren't many people who lie awake at night worrying about the consistency of arithmetic, though I do know one person who believes it isn't consistent. So that, you know, the proof is that it's a very limited category. I think that the category that is important to me is insight. And in fact, that makes me think of Bernard Lonergan, a great Canadian Jesuit theologian of the middle of the 20th century, who wrote a famous, quite difficult book called Insight. And he's writing very much in the Thomist tradition. And one of his theses is that the search for understanding, through and through, conducted without preconceptions, is ultimately the search for God. There's a wonderful passage towards the end of the book, which is one of my favourite quotes. He says, "God is the all-sufficient explanation, the eternal rapture glimpsed in every Archimedean cry of Eureka." It's a wonderful sentence, and it speaks both to the physicist and the priest in me.
Yes.
Okay, then the last example that you gave on how science and theology would interrelate, you get the rise and fall and rising of quantum field theory, and you compare that with Christology studies. But why could you expand on why this is not just a coincidence, but this is something necessary? Or, I mean,
well, the aim of the exercise, which may or may not be fulfilled, but the aim of the exercise is to strip away the externals of these particular investigations, the particular dimensions of reality, and to see the rational structures and the rational strategies that underlie those approaches. I use the comparison of birds and human beings look pretty different, but if you look at the skeletons, you can see that wings and limbs have homologies with each other, trying to do the same sort of thing. And it seems to me that this alternation between having a sort of minimal stripped down account, which is what I see S-matrix theory as being, which I see the Christ of faith as being, compares with richer and in my view, more adequate attempts, which I would see things like quantum field theory and a wider Christology as being evolved.
Just as a side of that, I see that you would know this, and I'm afraid it's not my field enough to know that when David Gross and so on were trying to investigate asymptotic freedom, I seem to remember something in reading about them in the book, that some of them were actually trying to prove that no quantum field theory could be consistent, and then they got this surprising result that actually there was asymptotic freedom, and it sort of saved the thing. I don't know whether it has any relevance to the parable, but you know.
I'm not sure. If I knew that, I'd forgotten it. It's quite possible. I mean, it would certainly fit in with David Gross's personality to be a demolition expert, I think. Yeah, it could be so.
Okay.
But that again, I mean, if you like, shows the openness that's necessary in rational inquiry. You set out with a particular aim in view, but you have to allow the actual reality of your encounter to shape your thoughts and change your thoughts, to push you in a totally different direction. And it's a very nice example of that. That's correct. I'm sure you've got that from somewhere reliable.
Gerald has a question. I'm thinking a little more about your analogy between quantum field theory and, for instance, the S-matrix theory as an intermediate, and also the study for the historical Jesus as part of Christology. Now, what I think you're absolutely right that in science you cannot properly think if you have no presuppositions whatsoever, that you have to accept something. Yeah. But it is essential for science that nothing that you have accepted before has to remain out of the discussion. Everything has to can be at stake. Yeah. Would you also hold the same view for, say, if in the study for the historical Jesus, that one of the results could be the things that you had believed before, or that turn out not to be true? And for instance, what you have believed on the basis of Scripture, is that also should we also be willing to put that at stake?
Well, I think we have to follow the truth where it leads us, and I don't think there is any privileged realm of a type that can be exempt from the possibility of correction. I believe that fruitful understanding nearly always, perhaps always, is in some sort of continuous relationship with what's gone before, but it may be in a large and surprising relationship. And a lot of the discussion, obviously, the relationship between the Hebrew scriptures and the New Testament are concerned with that. And it's clear that all the writers of the New Testament come with a belief that the Lord our God is one Lord, and that they're nevertheless having to modify that belief in the sense that they feel they've encountered the lordship of the risen Christ, and so you get that sort of negotiation going on, and that sort of continues, and so that yeah, I think that. But it seems to me that in a sense, even less than theology than we're back to this question of apophatic theology, what we know and what we don't know about God. We have to be careful not to be rationally overconfident, but we have to be careful not to be totally dumb. And we have prayerfully and humbly to seek such truth as we can find, or such truth as is given and revealed to us. And you know, the original meaning of the word theologian was not an academic person who thinks about these issues. It was essentially a person who prays. And it is in that context, I think it's in the context of theology, it's very important. I often think that if you think of strictly academic departments of theology in universities, they're a little bit like theoretical groups with no experimental contact. In actual fact, of course, many of the people do have experiential contact because they are believers and worshipping people, but the style of it is different, and you can do some things that way. When I taught a bit of science and theology in Cambridge for a number of years, when I came back there, I used to teach two sorts of courses. I taught a course in the Faculty of Divinity, and there you conducted in a sort of suitably academic style. I mean, you presented arguments, but you didn't reveal your own feelings about these things. And I also taught a course in the Federation of Theological Colleges, that's an association of seminaries in Cambridge, training people for Christian ministry. And the mode of lecturing was quite different in those things. We not only share the Christian faith, but we acknowledge that we share the Christian faith, and that way he presented things. It wasn't a question that you would get away with arguments in one that you couldn't get away with in the other. It was a question you had a broader base of experience and reference in one than you had in the other.
Maybe the expectation of the pursuit of knowledge in either field, though, is not so much for a demolition, but for a richer understanding.
Yes, absolutely, right. I agree. I mean, I think it's very unlikely in any form of developed rational inquiry into reality that people in the past were totally mistaken about everything. I mean, that's one of these things that, people come along, people who find that, I don't know, some Gnostic gospel or something, and now we really know what Christianity is about. It's all been, I mean, it's pretty implausible that's so. And yes, you expect there to be continuity, but there will be moments of surprise. And physics, of course, the ways we've thought about several times this morning, I mean, has plenty of examples of that. It just isn't that Ohm's law was all nonsense and throw it away. I mean, it's pretty good for most things, but it doesn't do everything. And there is a deeper theory which coherently and consistently relates those two regimes to each other.
More questions?
I was
Yes.
just going to add a comment actually onto that, which is in the way that God seems to have designed everything to work really well for us, indeed, for us to enjoy. It's kind of interesting that there are sort of easy things so that when people started they were able to work things out, but there are still some more complicated things so that as people go along there's still some more to find out. Do you know what I mean? It seems to have been nicely managed across the timeline to some extent, doesn't it? It could have all been over in the snap of a finger, or it could have been so hard that we couldn't have got anywhere with it, but yeah.
Well, the fact that the world is intelligible to a degree, and the fact that human experience is intelligible to a degree, is, I think, a significant fact about the world. We clearly, it seems to me, we clearly live in a world that is more like a cosmos than a chaos. And that in itself is quite a significant fact about the world. And people divide into two classes: those who think that is a significant thing to think about the world, and those who can't see the point of it. They say, well, of course, obviously we understand the world. And the modern recourse is to appeal to evolutionary necessity as the great explanatory factor of that. But I think, as I indicated, I think there's undoubtedly, truth in those insights, but I think that that truth is actually quite limited in its explanatory power.
Any more questions for John?
Not all done.
I might just make a comment about it. I've written some really far out papers lately that say that it's even theories that are very much like our present theories, like the universe going on forever, there is the potential danger that the theories could produce, and almost all brains would just be produced by quantum fluctuations, and they wouldn't have the order that we see. So it seems it's by no means obvious, even within our present understanding of physics, why there is this order. I mean, I'm not saying this in the sense that I believe we're a quantum fluctuation. I mean, I do believe we got here through an orderly evolution. But even within the laws of physics as we know it, it is sort of it's still a little bit of an open question. I mean, there's a big matter of controversy as to how can you explain this, as to why we aren't just some vacuum fluctuation sometime in the future if the universe lasts long enough. So it's by no means obvious why the universe should be intelligible, and so that's presumably some remarkable contingent fact about the universe.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, I go back to saying. I mean, I think there is a role for speculation in physics, but it needs to be treated with caution. That would be one thing I'd want to say. Something else I want to say. I've forgotten what that is now. I don't suppose that's any great loss. Oh yes, I'm a very reluctant subscriber to the happy accident theory of how things have happened. I mean, I'm pretty committed to the principle of sufficient reason that we can't, often of course we can't attain the sufficient reasons for things to happen. That's the direction in which I think our thoughts should go. And the sort of, gee, that's the way it is response doesn't seem to me intellectually very satisfying.
Can I give you an odd example of that? My dad's an engineer, and the first time I thought science and religion could possibly go together was because he is such a practical man. He really is an out-and-out engineer. He told me there are two sorts of people in this world, engineers and non-engineers, and when I said I was going to do physics, I was a disgrace. So he is, as I say, a total engineer. And yet he is also very religious, and that kind of raised the contradiction for me to start with. When I used to say to him, well, why, one of the things he said was, there are just too many conveniences, and the examples that he gives are very practical ones. So he says, for example, water freezes and expands, and so it goes to the top.
Yeah.
And if it behaved as it ought to, rivers would freeze from the bottom,
Right.
and so there would be no fish. And he said, and then I said to him when I got further on in school, I said, oh, there are all sorts of chemical reasons. I asked my teacher about what you said. There are all sorts of chemical reasons why. He said, yeah, exactly. But that was, so his idea is very much that it's.
Yes, I mean, that's the sort of one dimension of the anthropic principle argument. And a chap called Henderson wrote a book in 1914 or thereabouts, drawing attention to there are many anomalous properties of water which seem to be really, really essential for it. When I read Jacques Monod's famous book, Chance and Necessity, it was very hard reading for physicists. It's full of all this biochemical stuff, and I really found it quite hard to struggle with that. But Monod, of course, thesis is that it's all chance and therefore all meaningless, and so on. The ancient covenant is in ruins, and it sort of ends with a sort of not ignoble by any means, heroic defiance. Humans have created a little island of meaning lapped around by the waters of meaninglessness, and we defy the hostile universe. It's a sort of stoic view. Has its own ability about it. I think it's profoundly mistaken. But what really excited me about that book, all this stuff about biochemistry and so on, and how it all came out of DNA and all that. And I thought, good heavens, these chemical properties really all stem from Maxwell's equations for electromagnetism and the Schrödinger equation for quantum mechanics. Put together and stir, and they produce all these amazing chemical properties, amazing way in which these things work and so on. And I could write those equations on the back of an envelope. They're suitably condensed thing, and that was just to me a wonderful thought that such simple looking equations should have such fantastic consequences, as you and me at the end of the day. So it induced in me a religious thought rather than an irreligious thought. These things depend on how you approach them.
I may misunderstood you, but somehow I understood it when you speak about the Christ and the God, that past never describe a future. And I just want to your comment on God saying, "I'm a God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob."
Yeah.
And actually, I believe that God is a God of history. So it means that somehow by history we can know Him. Yeah. And I would say maybe when we say that we understand one day find a God a bit different. Maybe it is like in physics. Actually, we could not say that Newtonian mechanics is completely wrong. If you will say to the building engineer, please do your quantum mechanic calculation to put the foundation, probably he will no. So nevertheless, is it not so that still the God is, as it was said, that it is the same yesterday, today, and tomorrow? So maybe we should somehow look for some kind of the remedy between this process theology and the traditional theology, because maybe the God is still the same, and somehow He will always be the same. Only our knowledge somehow increases, but it's not only a revolutionary change. Because I think so that maybe we are somehow often too easy. I came from the country where we pass through the revolution somehow, because it is, of course, brought by Russians, but still. So we are afraid of revolution. We would like much smaller changes than generally.
Well, I of course absolutely believe that God has revealed and continues to reveal the divine nature through history. And you talked about the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Of course, that's the God. Jesus appealed to that in his argument with the Sadducees about whether there is a destiny beyond death. Every story that science tells ends ultimately in futility, decay, mortality, essentially from the physics point of view because of the second law of thermodynamics, from the biological point of view because that's the necessary character of the evolutionary process. So there is no, as far as the story that science can tell, not only our individual lives are going to end in futility, but even the universe itself is ultimately going to end in futility. But of course, the horizontal story of science is not the only story to tell. Jesus points the Sadducees to the vertical story of God's faithfulness. And his argument essentially is, if the patriarchs mattered to God once, which for sure they did, and God is the faithful God of whom Jesus speaks, then they will matter to God forever. And so Abraham, Isaac and Jacob will not be thrown away like broken pots at the end of their lives, having served their turn. They will have a destiny beyond death. And I think that's the basic reason why we have the hope of a destiny beyond death. Of course, as Christians we believe that's also exemplified and guaranteed through the seed event, seminal event of the Lord's resurrection. So that's and the fundamental question in relation to eschatology is, does the world make sense? Is the world in the end, ultimately, despite its amazing fruitfulness and order and structure and rational beauty and so on at the moment, is it in the end a chaos rather than a cosmos? You know, Stephen Weinberg notoriously says at the end of the first 3 minutes that the more he understands the universe, the more it seems to be pointless, because he's only telling that horizontal story. So the question is, does the world make not just sort of passing sense today, but does it make ultimate sense? And I think it does, and I think it does because I believe in the faithfulness of God. So I very much agree.
Yes.
On the question of analogies between religious belief and, say, quantum theory.
Speak louder, please.
Stand up.
Sure.
Dr. Act.
One of the questions in religious belief is the relationship of the new law to the old law. So there's the Decalogue and the Mosaic law, and yet we have a simplified version of it because although we follow the commandments, we can work. So there's also an analogy between that and then Newtonian physics and quantum mechanics, because quantum mechanics we believe gives rise to Newtonian physics, although we haven't done the explicit calculation because it would take the lifetime of the universe. But we believe that, and yet there's a consistency between them. Now you can, I like this analogy, but you can only push it so far. So what are the strengths and limits of this?
I'm not trying to give a general answer to that question. It's a very interesting analogy that you made there, which is not one that has occurred to me. I mean, I do believe that God has been and is engaged in a process of progressive self-revelation, and I believe that it's only possible to make sense, actually, for me, of the Old Testament by seeing it in those developmental terms. I mean, there's lots of terrible things in the Old Testament. You can read the book of Joshua, the book of Judges, acts of genocide, and so on. And is the extinction of the Amalekites demanded by the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ? I think it's very difficult to reconcile those things. So I think there is an unfolding degree of not of course that God's nature changed, but the human degree of apprehension of the divine nature does change. And you see that happening in the Old Testament, where of course the time span of the writings is much longer than it is in the New Testament. And I think that we need to take the character of the Hebrew Scriptures very seriously. I mean, they're a very important part of the Scripture, but equally we have to take their mixed character in this sense seriously as well. We have to have something. I mean, you know, when Dawkins comes along and simply concentrates on the genocidal passages in the Old Testament and says what an awful God is. I mean, he's of course making a partial point. He's making it for a polemical purpose, but we have to have something that we say by way of response to that. I can't see anything to say except that this is a progressive revelation, that there was partial understanding and partial misunderstanding in earlier times.
Thank you. Yes.
Thank you. Take my life in my hands, being a non-scientist, but you referred on a number of occasions, I think, to motivated belief.
Right. Yeah.
And if I understand it right, I can see how that works in science. You collect evidence to support the view. If you have no evidence to support the view, then that view isn't going to survive. If you apply that to religion, then I find that trickier. I find that a trickier connection to make, and I find it even trickier because you refer a great deal to the Bible. And the Bible, the book that I have, that I get in my hand when I go home,
has a very odd history.
Yes.
It's composed of a large number of disparate documents, and those documents in themselves have histories and translations and retranslations. I'm interested in, well, what is the quality of the Bible as evidence? And are there other aspects of motivated belief that you draw beyond the Bible?
Well, I think it's important to, yeah, you asked all the very important questions there. I think the first thing we have to say about the Bible is that it's not a book. It's a library. It contains all sorts of different kinds of writing, as you say, from all kinds of different periods. And when we read something, out of respect for what we're reading, we have to figure out the genre of what we're reading. I mean, it's a bad mistake to read poetry as if it were prose. In my view, it's a bad mistake to read Genesis 1 as if it were a blow-by-blow account of a six-day period to save us the trouble of doing physical cosmology. It's about something different from that, actually more interesting than that. It says nothing exists except through the will of God. So we have to read the Bible in a discriminating way. We have to again to recognize that the Bible contains stories and it contains history, and sometimes it's difficult to know which is which. And certainly different people will draw the line in different places between those two. We have to remember, as I said, I think earlier this morning, that in the ancient world, you can illustrate this out of secular writings in the ancient world, people were interested essentially in writing about people to get across the main point. And they weren't so worried about accurate nitty-gritty accounts of exactly what they said or exactly when they said it. And I refer to the two Lucan accounts of the Ascension as an example of that. There are many others. Another good example actually is in Acts. In Acts there are 3 accounts of Paul's conversion on the road to Damascus. Again, the same writer is recording them. So did everybody hear the voice from heaven? Did everybody fall to the ground? Was Paul told what to do on the spot, or was he told he was to go to Damascus and he was told what his vocation was to be? Those 3 accounts answer those questions in different ways. But they're all telling essentially the same story. That Paul encountered the risen Christ, was commissioned, his life was transformed, he was commissioned by him to carry the good news to the Gentiles. That's what ancient writers were concerned with, to get the main point across. So we have to read it in discriminating ways like that. If I think about my Christian belief, I sometimes give talks about natural theology and all that sort of thing to defend the notion of the coherence of theistic belief and try and put the question of the existence of God on the agenda. But I quite often at the end will say, perhaps in the discussion period, that those arguments, though I think they have some value, are not the centre of my own religious belief. My own religious belief centres on my encounter with Christ, as I believe I meet him in the New Testament, which I want to read with my intellectual eyes open, but when I read that, I believe I encounter this strange, mysterious, exciting, undeniably significant figure in the church and in the sacraments. And that's the sort of experience that motivates my Christian belief. It's a richer form of experience than scientific experience. It's a more ambiguous form, as all forms of personal encounter are. I mean, if we think about our opinions of common friends, we won't all agree about how exactly we assess their characters. It's a more complex area, but that's because it's a more important area. And there are, I mean, it's not simple and straightforward, but I think that for me there's enough motivation there to commit my life to.
Yes, good, thank you.
Just wondering, where do you stand on other religious and spiritual traditions, maybe those from the East and things like that?
That's a very good question, I may say so. Yes, I'm puzzled by that. It seems to me that, I want to say a number of things. First of all, I want to say that I don't think we're all completely right and they're completely wrong. It's a much more subtle thing. That people in other faith traditions are no longer strange people in faraway countries who believe odd things. They're living down the street, they're our neighbours, and we can see the spiritual authenticity of their lives. And we can't just write them off as being benighted heathens or something like that. So I want to take them seriously, and of course it's pretty plausible, isn't it, really, that God would not have left the divine nature without some form of witness at any time, in any place. I mean, if God's principal mode of self-revelation is to be through incarnation, that has to take place at a particular time, in a particular place. But that's not the only way which God makes the divine nature known. So I think that all the religious traditions preserve spiritual experience, and they have a sort of cousinly relationship. What is deeply puzzling and disturbing is that they have such different things to say about the nature of that experience. I think there are two strategies which I think are really no use at all. One is to say that really they're all saying the same thing in different cultural languages. That seems to me clearly not true. Not only because they disagree about, say, the status of Jesus or the status of the Quran, things of that nature, but also because they just disagree about general metaphysical positions. I mean, all the three Abrahamic faiths see the individual human person as of lasting, continuing significance in the sight of God. Our Hindu friends perceive persons as being in some sense recycled through reincarnation, which is an idea I can't even make sense of, let alone believe in. And of course our Buddhist friends, who I understand the doctrine of anatta are right, say that the human person is essentially an illusion from which eventually we are to seek release. Now those are not three groups of people saying the same thing in culturally different languages. There's a definite clash there. And it doesn't do anybody any good to pretend that isn't the case. That's one thing I want to say. The other thing I want to say is, and of course it's very puzzling to us, but particularly scientists. I mean, science started at a particular occasion, Western Europe, 17th century, if you like, in its modern form. Now it's spread worldwide. You stop somebody in the street, in London, in Benares, in Kyoto, and you ask them what matter's made of, provided you stop the right person, you'll get the answer quite sure. You ask people in those three cities, what's the nature of ultimate reality? The chances are you're going to get distinctly different answers. And that is perplexing and unsettling, really, in many ways. But I don't think the answer is which is the other strategy which I would take, which is the sort of lowest common denominator approach. Of course the religious traditions do have things in common. They all have some clear conception of encounter with sacred reality, though they give different accounts of that. They all, for example, value compassion. So there are things that they have in common. But if you simply reduce religious belief to just the things that the lowest common denominator that you can detect, you get an extraordinarily sort of etiolated version of religion, something that no religious adherent of a faith tradition will be very anxious to sign up to. It's just too feeble. The paradox of the interfaith problem is that the thing that gives the different faith traditions their vitality is also the things that divides them from each other. And I've had a certain amount of experience of interfaith contact. There was something called Science of the Spiritual Quest, which was organised by CTNS at Berkeley, which brought together groups of, in the first phase, groups of people from the Abrahamic faith. Later, there was a second phase which I didn't participate in, which involved world faith traditions worldwide. Brought together groups with the same science in common, but different religious traditions. I was in a physics group, and we had Jewish, Islamic, and Christian people there. And we had some interesting discussions. It was slow work, and it was only the tiny beginning of things. So there are contacts. But I think when we do that, I think in our encounter with people from other faith traditions, I myself feel I have things to learn from them, and I want to learn those things. But I don't think I'm going to help them by somehow soft-pedaling my belief in the unique significance of Jesus. That's one of the things I bring to the discussion, and just to sort of pretend I don't believe that, just to make life easy, is dishonest in my view. So there's a real problem there. And I think this is a very pressing problem. I think after the problem of even suffering, which is the most difficult problem really to speak, I think the problem of the diversity of the world's faith is the second most troubling thing. And we're just beginning to discussion, and it's going to go on a long time, and it's going to be painful and difficult. I think it's a problem for the third millennium, not for the 21st century. It's going to be a long sort of discourse. And I think that the science can provide a little, you see, initially the faith traditions need to, if they're to meet each other, on ground where there are serious issues to discuss, but not ones that threaten the core beliefs, immediately threaten the core beliefs of the different traditions. I don't think it's any good having a meeting together and say, okay, today we're going to talk about Jesus, tomorrow we're going to talk about the Quran, and so on. That's the third day about the Torah. That's too threatening. Defences go up straight away. But if you meet and say, look, what do we make about science's understanding about the history and nature of the world, and how does that relate to our religious beliefs about the world as a creation. That's a serious issue, but but not one that is instantly threatening. I think that's how we have to begin to meet each other. And that's what this science and the spiritual quest thing was trying to do. But it is a big problem, and I'm frankly perplexed by it. I do occasionally write about it, but I don't always know what to write.
I understand there's a group in the divinity faculty here who meet together, an interfaith group, and do actually read each other's scriptures, which is a healthy thing to be doing.
Yeah, there's a group called Scriptural Reasoning Group, drawn out of the Abrahamic faiths. And one of the chief organisers is a very attractive and perceptive and sympathetic Jewish thinker, Peter Ox. And they meet here in Cambridge, David Forth, the Regis Professor of Divinity involved. They compare the scriptural reasoning between the three faiths. It's the questions between the three Abrahamic faiths are, of course, obviously quite critical, but they do have really quite a lot in common. The relationship with the Eastern faiths is much more perplexing, at least insofar as I understand the Eastern faiths, which isn't obviously very much, but on the face of it, it seems much more perplexing.
Well, thank you for that very helpful and detailed answer, John.
Oh, thanks for the question.
Yes, it is an important question. That's right. Well, we're approaching lunchtime. John stopped speaking earlier, but that has, of course, given us a much greater opportunity to probe him with our questions.
I like the discussion period the best. That's part of the reason why I do tend to stop early, because I know what I'm going to say. I have to say something to set an agenda. Obviously, I can't just stand up and say, ask me a question. I have to say something to set an agenda, but it's in discussion and interesting things come up.
I think many of us have read your books as well, so we're perhaps familiar to some degree with what you're likely to say, many of us. So, but anyway, I think maybe we can go until past.
The lady here.
Oh, I was just going to ask you, this is a question that I was discussing with the year 7s, okay? Because we're doing, as one does in year 7, this is 11-year-olds, all right? We're doing sexual reproduction at the moment.
Right.
And we were talking about sperms and eggs and all the rest of it.
Yeah.
And we were talking about how, you know, the chance of that one sperm and that one egg getting together was so tiny. And then looking back over the generations, gosh, yes, and your parents, it had, you know, that particular combination, etc., etc. So then they wanted to know, well, if it had been different, would they not have been here? Would it have been somebody else? And I was just wondering, when we were talking about kind of, you know, how many happy accidents and how much intervention does God need to do in order to, if each one of us is special and meant to be here, that would be quite a lot of...
Well, there is a tension. I mean, as Scripture says, before you were in the womb, I knew you. And there are lots of this and that sort. And there is some strong affirmation there of God's individual purpose for individual human beings. But I myself find it impossible to believe that God selects and steers a particular sperm in the direction of a particular egg. I think there is an accepted contingency about the world. That's an interesting question. But
I guess from their point of view, the question is, would it have been them but with brown eyes, you know, if they had blue eyes, or would it have been someone totally different?
It would be somebody different. I think it seems to be very important to take seriously our individuality and not to pretend that there isn't a contingent element in this. And of course, that contingency just spreads through life. I mean, I got into physics from mathematics, and I was very well taught mathematics at school, and it's a very exciting subject at school if you can do it. And that steered me in that direction. If I could have had the same degree of mathematical ability, but say been badly taught and been put off in some other direction. I mean, life is full of contingency, and I think we have to accept that. And I don't think that God has a unique plan. It's a bit like who you marry. I mean, I want to be careful about who you marry, but there isn't a unique person that God wants you to marry, and if you don't meet that person, then you better remain single. I mean, it's a bit more open than that, it seems to me. It is perplexing. I mean, the whole relationship between contingency and regularity, between purpose and happenstance, is very perplexing to think about. But I think we have to take both sides of those equations seriously, actually.
Yes.
As I understand you, if I understand you correctly, you mean that God sets up laws of nature, or immutable laws of nature, or have I misunderstood you in your view?
Immutable laws.
Immutable?
Because
Well, yeah. Well, I think that the laws of nature issue from the will of God, and I think that God has some fixed purposes. God is not capricious. That's back to the question of miracle. I don't say that the uniformity that we know is immutable in an absolute sense, but I think that God is faithful, and it has been a very traditional religious thinking to see the regularities of nature as reflections of the faithfulness of the Creator, seed time and harvest, and all that sort of thing. So I think God does bring into being a world which is a cosmos and not a chaos, a world that has deep-seated regularities in it, which are expressions of the divine will, and which are in fact necessary, of course, to be a world of moral responsibility. I mean, if you need a pretty large degree of regularity so you can estimate the consequences of actions in some reliable way without having total certainty. If there's to be moral responsibility in the world, so yeah, I somehow or other, it seems to me that the Christian thinking has to steer a course between two unacceptable pictures of God's relationship to creation. One is the picture of the cosmic tyrant, the God whose creation is a puppet theatre. God pulls every string, everything is organised in that sort of way. That was the God against whom Whitehead incidentally rebelled very strongly. And that isn't, I think, the God, Father, our Lord Jesus Christ, because it's in the nature of love not to insist on total determining control over the objects of love, as we know as parents. Equally, of course, God is not the deistic spectator, indifferent deistic spectator of the world, sets it all spinning, sits back and says, oh, I wonder what's going to happen next. God interacts with the world, but does not overrule the world. God gives to creatures a degree of freedom, but God is not an untrammeled degree of freedom.
I think there's an alternate way of looking at it. I see it as a possibility that God is continuously, through His will, upholding the world.
Yeah.
And what we perceive as natural law is really God's usual way of how He usually is in interacting with this.
Yes, well, I would agree with that. I mean, I think the laws of nature are expressions, not the sole expressions, but are expressions of the Creator. Because I think God is not capricious, God doesn't change the divine mind. Doesn't say, well, it would be a little bit better if we'd made the world work this way rather than that. So I think that the regularities of the world reflect, if you like, the faithfulness of the Creator. But I think the process is sufficiently open to the future, in the way we've been discussing this morning, that not only do we play a part in bringing about the future, but not only do the laws of nature constrain the way in which the future develops, but God also interacts providentially with the world. There's been in the 1990s, an enormous amount of discussion in science and theology arena about divine providential action, which of course neither Satan totally agreed and had a good conclusion, but which certainly reached the conclusion that science itself has not established on its own terms the causal closure of the world, so that we are not forbidden to believe that God interacts with the world from what science can reliably tell us. And I think that's itself quite to defeat the defeaters, the claim that this is a mechanical world which just goes on its way it was an important gain. It did not answer every question. And you see, if it is true that the openness of the future partly derives from the intrinsic unpredictabilities present in physical process as science describes it, then there will always be a sort of cloudiness about what's going on in the world. It will never be possible to disentangle things in an unambiguous way, saying nature did this, human agency did that, divine providential action did the third thing. They will be inextricably intertwined with each other. That doesn't mean to say that God's providence is not discernible by faith, but it means it's not demonstrable by experiment. Somebody sitting on the banks of the Revd Sea, and a gang of fleeing slaves come along to this marshy ground. The wind gets up in a big way, drives back the water, the slaves get across. Their pursuers enter the marsh, and as they enter the marsh, the wind drops, the water comes back, the pursuers are clogged up and drowned. Nothing can force that spectator to say more than, gosh, that was a pretty lucky accident. let those slaves get away. But equally, nothing can forbid one of the fleeing slaves to say that was God's great act of deliverance of Israel from slavery in Egypt. There is an inescapable ambiguity in the interpretation of history in that way, I think.
Well, thank you very much. John has just come back from a world tour just a couple of days ago, and we're so grateful for all the time you've given us. Thank you very much indeed for being with us.